if somebody has to really work towards something, I feel it is about making the system equitable to ensure that everybody gets a fair chance to report.
Hi, this is Shashank,
Hi, this is Tavishi.
and welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast.
Hi, Uma. It's so good to have you with us today. It's so good to see you again. And I'll give it back to you. Let's start by a quick introduction, of you, from you. What do you do? What is your background? And what is Rati Foundation?
Thank you, Shashank. I think it's the pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me, and I'm absolutely looking forward to this conversation. So, my name is Uma Subramanian. A disclaimer: I am not an engineer. I am not a tech policy person. I am a trained social worker who happens to work very closely with victims of online gender-based violence and victims of sexual violence and other forms of violence. So I bring that lens to this conversation. I am privileged to work in an organization which is a multidisciplinary team of lawyers, social workers, counselors, researchers, and people who work with technology. And our mission is really to ensure that spaces are safe for women, children, and other marginalized genders, both online and on ground. So we bring in the victim centric perspective and we work in a multidisciplinary approach. We are a team based in Mumbai, and RATI stands for Rights, Action, Technology, and Inclusion. All our programs, both in the space of online safety and ensuring victims are safe on ground, are geared towards that. So, yeah, thank you
Awesome,
for having
awesome,
me
Uma.
once again.
And I must say, your website is so beautiful. I always have fun sort of navigating it. It's so colorful and nice. And we have definitely to learn from you. And we'll put your website in the show notes for everybody. Diving into the conversation, Uma, some of the most important work you do is running a trust line to help victims of online violence and abuse, both for children and I understand for women as well. And of course, when we say children, we're not only talking about people who are under the age of 18 here. Um, but I want to start by asking you, Uma, what was the initial conversation with you or with your partners at Rati for the need for such a helpline?
So actually, we ended up working on the issue of online safety itself through one of the cases that we were dealing with. This is way back in 2015 when we had a case of a minor boy who was sexually abused. And the boy was groomed on a social media platform, and subsequently, there was a POXO case that was registered, and we were the support persons in that particular case. Everybody got into the gear, started implementing POXO, and in the conversation, the boy ended up asking us, I have shared certain images with this perpetrator. What happens to those images? I think that was really the starting point for us in terms of what happens to these images when children or women end up sharing, and those images are used for blackmailing, threatening, coercing them, and the abuse continues. Uh,
No, no,
Sorry,
and Uma,
Shashank,
was
you.
this why I'm asking you? This is before you conceptualize the tip line. This is, yeah,
This is yeah,
yeah.
this is way before we
Hmm.
conceptualized the tip line. So the trust line started
Hmm.
in 2022. I'm talking about 2015 because one of the first things that we did is we launched a hotline in partnership with one of the world's leading hotlines, Internet Watch Foundation, and we started experimenting with that. We worked very closely with the ministries, etc. And then somewhere in 2018-19, when we hit the ground with our
Hmm.
ideal internet research, we asked children and young people, what do
Hmm.
you want when you're faced with an online issue? And the responses is pretty much what the
Hmm.
trust line is. They said, we don't want a bot. They said, we don't want to get through 5 layers of technology to be able to reach a human person. We want a
Hmm.
bhaiya or a didi to hold our hand and take us through this entire process
Hmm.
step by step. We don't want to tell our parents, or we don't want our
Hmm.
parents to know upfront. We definitely don't want to go
Hmm.
to the police upfront. So can there be somebody who we can
And
trust?
this is only
And
for
I think
children.
it's very interesting. When we started, we said the trust line is going to be for minors, but in year one, what we realized that a lot of adult women, young women, adult women started reaching out to us and said, "We know you're for minors,
Mm,
but please help us because there's no other
mm.
place that we can go to." So we ended up expanding the scope of the trust line, and now trust line focuses on working with adults and children.
Awesome. That's
Yeah,
very interesting to know the background behind how the tip line came up. And again,
yeah.
the next question I have is uh, what are the some of the major findings after the tip line has come into being? It's so interesting to know, Uma, because as you were saying, people who suffer this abuse or violence need a helping hand, they need a helping ear, which organizations like yours provide, and sort of solve for those problems at a more sort of ground level. But coming back to once the tip line has been running, what have been some of the major learnings for you or major insights for you from running the tip line? Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to
Yeah.
slight correction there, Shashank. It's
Hmm.
not a tip line, it's
Got
a
it.
trust line. So what we basically did was take the traditional
Got it.
principles of social work and fuse the whole tech aspect with it, right? So, and we don't want to be
Got it.
called as a helpline because we want to be called as a trust line because we want
No,
clients to
and
be
Uma,
able
can
to
you?
trust us. So,
Yeah, that's so useful
on,
that you're pointing
yeah.
out. Can you sort of people who don't know the importance of this terminology? Can you point out what why you want to be known as a trust line versus the others?
Sure, sure, sure. So I think, so like I said, a tip line or a hotline is basically it can be a static form, which anybody from the general public can use and register a complaint or lodge a complaint. So you have the IWF hotline, you have the NICMEC cyber tip line, so on and so forth, right? The trust line is your traditional telephonic helpline. So we have trained counselors who man not just the phones but who also man chats, because we see a lot of young people, a lot of children, they're not comfortable speaking about this, so they want to chat with us and tell us. So we have functionalities on WhatsApp, and the idea is for us to be able to provide a space where they can trust us, right? Helping is one part of it, but I also think helping gives it a tone of,
Mm,
you're a
mm,
beneficiary and I am a provider. I think when we call them clients, that we are creating a space
mm,
where they question us, and
mm,
trust me, they do. And they say, how long are you going to like take to
mm,
get my content down? These are the cases that we love.
mm.
So I
Um,
think, yeah,
I
so I
love
think
that
that's the
articulation.
difference.
Thank you for saying that. And
Yeah.
just coming back to my previous question, I'll sort of elaborate it a bit more. What are the sort of main kinds of abuse you see children and women facing, whether it's on the internet or offline, through your experience of your work?
Sure. So when we launched the trust line, we were very clear that in phase one, we were going to look at two specific issues. And this was again because the data was pointing us in that direction, which was cyberbullying and loss of private or intimate content. And that was the mandate of the trust line, so to say, when we started. So in year one, for example, we've had about 800 odd contacts, and we were handling about 222 cases, which is typical of any trust line, right? It's close to like 10% or 20% is actual sort of issue
Mm,
related cases that come in. And like I said, most of the cases that were being reported to us were either of cyberbullying or loss of intimate content. Now, mind you, these are not two
mm,
watertight categories. So a case or a report that comes to you which might look like a case of cyberbullying, but when you start deep diving into the case with the victim, you realize that there is actually an element of loss of intimate content. There is an element of that as well. So usually these instances are overlapping, but majority of our cases fall under these two categories. Now, under each category, so for example, if you look at
mm,
cyberbullying itself, almost like 56% of our cases fall in the category of, either there is impersonation, or there are threats of online consequences, or the account has been hacked, doxed, etc. When you look at loss of intimate content, most of it is either solo sexual activity, or there is extortion, there's exchange of intimate imagery, so on and so forth. So I think those are
Hmm.
like largely the buckets, where the
Hmm.
trust line receives.
Thank you for introducing Mary Trustline to our listeners. And could you elaborate the kind of strategies or support mechanisms that the organization uses to address abuse, depending upon the nature of abuse?
Sure. So I think the strategies that we came up with really depends. The way we came up with the strategies was, what are the pain points for a victim of online, gender-based violence, right? We identified 4 to 5 pain points, and all our strategies are geared towards that. Our first and the most requested sort of service is content takedown. So if you're a victim of online gender-based violence, the victim is extremely, in a heightened state where the victim says, please make sure that nobody else is seeing the content. The content has to be taken down. So content takedown is the first sort of, support that we provide. The second, which is very correlated to content takedown, is that victims are distressed, right? So they need emotional support through proper counseling. So starting from providing psychological first aid se leke, sometimes victims are suicidal. There have been cases of suicidal ideation. You have to ensure there is in-depth therapy that goes hand in hand with content takedown. The third form of support that a lot of victims need is legal advice, legal guidance, and in certain cases, legal representation. So we are based in Mumbai. We have a team of in-house lawyers, and what we make sure is the victim has the wherewithal and the knowledge to take it forward and ensure that there is proper legal strategy that is applied to the case, if it is a case which is illegal in nature and needs to go to the police, etc. I think the fourth form of support for victims who are not based in the geography that we are, because Trustline is an all India helpline. In year one, we received calls from 25 states across the country. We've also had international callers where either the victim was a Indian or the perpetrator was an Indian. Now, in those cases, what victims need is verified on ground social referrals. You cannot give them random phone numbers. You cannot just tell them, go to this organization. You need verified partners. So that's the fourth service that we provide. And the last service, which is towards, I think, when the case is towards the closure part of it. Sometimes it's also happen as you're working with the victim, is informational support. So they need a lot of information to not just help them be safe in the future, but also ensuring that what are these processes, how do you go about doing this, that. So these are sort of five main areas of service that the trust line provides. And to answer your second part of the question, Tavishi, every case has a strategy that is put together by a multidisciplinary team. So we have counselors and the tech guys who are leading it, where we come up with a strategy of how are you going to work on content takedown and what are you going to do with the victim while the content is being actioned on. And then the other team members like social workers and lawyers support, the core team of counselors and the technical guys. So that every case has a case plan and a strategy. So that's how we go about doing this work.
Thanks, Uma. This has been very useful. I wanted to ask you, how do you think about managing privacy in these situations? Because I assume there would be a prolonged, protracted contact between the victims and the trust line, and they also have to share a lot of evidence and information with various stakeholders. So, how do you think, and how does your organization manage privacy and the expectations around privacy that victims might be having?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very critical aspect of even when we were designing the trust line. So, as a thumb rule, we do not ask for data that is not required from the victim to process the particular request, right? So, first and the most foremost thing for us is to understand the expectations of this victim. Based on those expectations, is when we decide what kind of data, is actually needed. So, for example, if the age of the victim is not important to process a particular request, we do not ask the age, right? So, like I said, we seek only that kind of information, that level of information, which is actually needed from the victim. The other part of it is that there is a constant loop of feedback, right? So, it also, privacy is something which also the victims need to be able to trust us, that giving them this information, giving them these screenshots, giving them, my ID, is actually going to see some result, actually going to help me process the request. So that level of rapport building and that level of relationship building is required with the victims, because mind you, their trust has already been violated. So for them to be able to reach out and we are asking them for more and more information, I think that's counterproductive to our cause. So we restrict the amount of data that is required of the victim, and we restrict it to only the necessary data that is required, for actioning that particular content. And we of course work very closely with victims to ensure these things are explained to them.
That's very helpful, and I think the focus that you have on privacy in a trust line is very refreshing, because generally victims face the problem of sharing excessive information, and often they don't want to share information either with counselors or with their parents or law enforcement.
Uma, one thing that's very interesting and is very important for the work you do around the trust line is actually actively work with platforms, as you were saying, to get content taken down. Um, and sometimes as lawyers we think the only way to move platforms is law and policy and regulation, and I know you have strong opinions about that, which I want you to say. But coming back to my question, what has been your experience working with platforms? You work with Stop
Hmm.
NCII, you work with platforms more closely, which is so when I look at your work, it seems to be such an important component of ensuring that content gets taken down at some point, even if it's not timely in some cases. So yeah, I would love to get your hear your experience about working with online platforms.
Yeah, I think I was waiting for the law enforcement question, but I will wait for that one. Working with the platforms, I think every platform has a different rule, which actually is a big headache for victims and for people like us, because, as you know, these offenses are not restricted to one particular platform. So, the victim might have met somebody on a particular platform, the conversation has moved on to some other platform, and the actual abuse is happening on third platform. So, one big issue that we face is that every platform has a different rule. So, what is up on, let's say, a platform like X can be easily taken down by Instagram, right? But it will still be up on X. So, depending on the platform itself, we set expectation for of victims. What we have seen with platforms is the more severe it is, the more sexual it is. If the child is a minor, if there is a case of doxing, if the victim has made a written report to the police and the victim attaches the copy of this report, taking down is easier. So the more detailed the report, it's easier. But what falls through sometimes is content that is not at its face value, doesn't look like, for example, CSAM. So to just give you a simple example, if it's, a category A
Mm,
CSAM, you know that the
mm,
platforms are going to action it. But we had a case of, I think, 13,
mm,
14-year-old girl. It was a completely normal image, but something as, simple as Microsoft
mm,
Paint was used to just point
mm,
out to her genitals, her, breasts. That image was circulated widely, and that image was used to
mm,
multiple platforms to harass her. Now something like this needs a lot of explanation, lot of context, that we need
mm,
to provide to the platforms, right? So I think it really depends on, the content. That's one. The second part of it is, some platforms do have, so one is there are these dynamic reporting guidelines. They keep changing,
yes.
their formats keep changing, and we need to, and it's victims find it extremely hard. There's also uncertainty of takedown that the victims face, so that's a big problem. The other part that we feel is that many,
Mm,
the big ones, the big platforms like your Instagram and your Facebooks are probably more proactive. WhatsApp remains to be a black box. It's a huge challenge, but in India, it's the most widely used platform. So that remains sort of a challenge. Smaller platforms, so who do not have a large user base in India, appealing to them, taking content down from those platforms becomes sometimes a challenge. And I also think certain, exploitative platforms, or platforms these are just purely hosting pornography, etc. There it becomes very, very challenging. So I think overall it's a mixed bag, and there is no one size fits all, which is a huge problem because standards of evidence are changing for each platform. So imagine the pressure it puts on a victim,
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think I wanted to bring up the WhatsApp question that you've already kind of alluded to, and we also, as students of technology, we get stumped as to how should we even think about the WhatsApp issue. But can we use situations like, is WhatsApp open for you to be like, okay, this is an account that is causing harassment, abuse, or violence? Are they sort of willing to listen to you more carefully, or do you think that because of its black box nature, it's difficult for them to also engage with you?
No, I think it's very
Hmm.
very subjective, right? And full disclosure, Mary Trustline is
Mm-hmm.
seed funded by Meta, right? That does not mean we don't
Yeah.
ask them these questions, and we've constantly questioned the mechanism, the
Yeah.
redressal mechanism of WhatsApp. So with WhatsApp, and because we are trusted flaggers, I think it's easier for
Yeah.
us to escalate it. All escalations does not necessarily
Of
mean the
course.
content is taken down. But the problem is, if you're not a trusted flagger, then
Yeah.
what? If you're just a lay person, then what? I think that entire thing is a black box then, because as a lay person you
Yeah.
really don't know what
Yeah,
is going
and
to
just the
happen to your
second point
content.
you mentioned, that's interesting, Uma, that about big tech versus smaller platforms, right? Platforms who might not have the resources to spend on content moderation as big tech does. In your experience, is there a lot of violence that's reported to you from other platforms as well? That's not forming part of the big tech suite. Hmm.
Not at the moment, but I think it's an
Hmm.
interesting space for us to watch, right? Because also it also depends on where your services
Interesting.
are publicized. So, for example, if Trustline is publicized on Instagram, we're going to get a lot of cases that are
Yeah.
on Instagram, etc. But having said that, I think currently we don't have a lot of
Hmm.
cases from smaller platforms, but it in the cases that we have received from these smaller platforms, it has been quite a challenge. Certain platforms don't even have a proper email address where we can write to. And then my teams have actually gone on the App
Hmm.
Store and written bad reviews, which has then triggered
That's very
triggered them
interesting.
reaching out to us. So all kinds of creative ways of pressurizing platforms.
Thanks, Shashank. Uma, I'd like to move back to something that you previously mentioned. How is your experience on dealing with law enforcement agencies, especially when it comes to content that involves image based sexual abuse or content that is
Yeah.
sexual in nature?
I this could be a separate podcast altogether, but I'm going to try and keep it short. I think first I'll start with the good news of working with law enforcement agencies, and then I'll give you the issues. So if you look at one of the things that India has right now, which is a cybercrime.gov.in portal, one has to acknowledge that it is one of the most victim friendly mechanisms, especially when it comes to anonymous reporting. Is it ideal? Far from it. But does it work well and people are using it? Yes, they are. And the data shows, right? So for example, if you just look at data between 2020 and 2023, there were more than 22 lakh complaints on this portal. And specifically when it comes to child pornography, online child pornography, rape and gang rape, there were more than a lakh and 58,000 reports on cybercrime portal. Now what does this tell us? This tells us that people want to break the silence. People want to report if they get the confidence that there is a scope that of anonymous reporting, and they want to be able to tell the law enforcement. But the moment you hit the ground, the moment you actually walk into a police thana, the response of law enforcement across the country has been subpar. And this is across the country. We've had victims from Maharashtra, Kerala, Bangalore. I mean, I can just go on and on, but has been subpar. Now, what happens is then prosecution is not going to happen, right? And the actual police officer sitting in the thana has absolutely no clue as to what to do. So we have had cases where victims have been told, लीक करने वाला है ना, लीक किया तो नहीं है ना, जब लीक करेगा तो आइए. As in, the content has not been leaked, right? He's about to leak it. So when it actually escalates, you come to us. And then we've had to reach a senior police officer, so on and so forth. I think the other issue is, if there are cases of sextortion, financial frauds, They will not look at sextortion. They'll say financial fraud hai na, aap jaiye and go and report it on cybercrime. At the level of police station, there are no standardized protocols for dealing with this kind of content. So we've had cases where the police officer has taken the mobile phone of the victim. The victim is there, the family is there, and he's opened a gallery and started scrolling. And mind you, these are intimate images. The child is traumatized, and she's now nervous because her parents are sitting right there. So, also, the thing that we talk about in sexual abuse, your past sexual history, which again the women's rights movement constantly has pushed back. Here, somewhere, the past sexual history, the conversation between the victim and the perpetrator, which sometimes at the face value might look, oh, the victim consented, or the victim has actually also engaged with this perpetrator, goes completely against her. And the judgment and the stigma that comes with that is, I mean, law enforcement is absolutely insensitive to that, right? I think couple of other issues is the actual financial burden on victims. So we've had a case where the victim, her mother, her father, all of them had to give away their mobile phones because the perpetrator had circulated her intimate images to all three of them. Now this is a financial burden on the victim's family. They're never going to get these mobile phones back, right? So it disrupts entire families, places them under a financial burden. Um, and the last part of it is, even till now, police in across the country, they do not use their minds and apply relevant sections of the IT Act or the POXO Act that deals with child sexual abuse. So you have had cases of POXO where they're applying all the sections of aggravated penetrative assault and other aspects of it, but they do not apply online. So this whole online on ground, that is not understood by law enforcement. So I think the law enforcement, overall, to sum it up, the law enforcement response is subpar, and there is a lot that needs to be done. And if there is one system that needs a complete overhaul in this country, it has to be the police. It has to be the law enforcement.
Thanks, Uma. That was very helpful. I wanted to ask a follow up question. When it comes to content that has to be taken down for cases of intimate sexual abuse, and there are instances of re upload of the content, do you think there are problems that are faced? What challenges have you seen in your experience that victims face? Do they have to approach the law enforcement again and again? Do they have to approach the courts again and again?
Who I think law enforcement has not been able to support victims with takedown of content at all. And we've seen law enforcement officers shooting letters and memos to Meta sitting in Silicon Valley with the addresses of United States of America, and then sharing that with us, saying, yes, we have put in a request for content takedown. It's never going to happen, right? So I think content takedown is something that currently the law enforcement in India has not been able to prove that they have capacity to do so. In terms of re-upload, so the victim's request, the first request is please delete it at source. And that is where it becomes extremely hard for us to manage our expectations. Say we cannot be deleting it from the source, because if it is in the perpetrator's device, the only people who are authorized to do so is the law enforcement agencies. In terms of prevention of re-upload, we have existing partnerships with Stop NCII or IWF, which we use and leverage to ensure that victims have some sort of relief. Uh, are they 100% foolproof? Things like Stop NCII, etc. Again, it's a growing science, it's an emerging science. We need to closely examine and monitor that. But have we had successes of cases? We also have seen some successful cases in prevention of re-upload. But does the law enforcement have capacity to prevent re-upload? No.
And Uma, if I may just jump in, alongside Tavishi's question, this is something we've tried to study again as observers of technology. Have you had instances of search engines? We've spoken about, social media or more communication-based applications. In some instances, we've studied that. These kind of websites who are non-responsive or are incentivized to host harmful content, these links keep coming up. So um, a victim can go to whatever redressal forum, and then that's taken down, including search engines. But then these links keep coming up, and then they have to keep going back. So have you experienced some these kind of instances in your experience? And I'm not asking for an answer, but like, how do you think we should think about this problem?
The answer is yes, that we have had instances. One particular case that was very peculiar
Hmm.
that came to us, and I also learned the
Hmm.
terminology from my team here, is something called as keyword
Hmm.
stuffing, right? And this was because this was a victim who was a victim of domestic violence, was going through bad sort of
Hmm.
divorce with her husband, and what he basically did was he just used her name, the name of the village where she belongs to, which is a
Hmm.
very, very
Hmm.
small village in Maharashtra. Um, and he tagged those two, and every time you would search this, a list of porn websites would come up. So the women who were shown in the videos, etc.,
Hmm.
was not her. But every time you typed her name and the name of the village, this was what was showing up, in the Google search. So I think the teams were able to take it down by identifying certain patterns, and also I think cleaning up and so on and so forth. I don't know
Hmm.
the technical details of it, but keyword stuffing is something that we learned at that point where we said there's no image of this woman, but just her name and her credentials are being misused, to defame her.
Oh, that's very interesting. What kind of support do you think, or what kind of changes can we make in policy or regulation, if any, to support the kind of work that you do? Of course, the fact that you're existing and you're doing such important work points already to a lacuna in law enforcement and governance. But do you think there's any
Hmm.
response that our lawmakers need to look at to sort of tackle this very pressing issue, or our courts need to get involved with? Because again, as you're pointing
Hmm.
out, capacity constraints at the police and law enforcement level, those capacity constraints we've noticed exist at the judiciary level as well. They find it a bit difficult to understand how technology works. In fact, sometimes technology companies themselves obfuscate how they function in court hearings, because it's not that
Hmm.
incentive to really be transparent. So, how should all of us think about coming at this problem from different layers? We are civil society. Of course, we
Hmm.
play an important role. Law enforcement plays an important role, but there are other stakeholders. The judiciary can push law enforcement. They have the sort of capacity and incentive to do
Hmm.
that. Lawmakers can push the entire system.
Hmm.
So, I know. Again, the conversation is not to give technical inputs. The conversation is like,
Of course.
you're working in this space, you're observing so many mechanisms working together. How are you thinking about these sort of other stakeholders getting involved?
See, I think couple of things that come to my mind. One is uh, some sort of legal immunity to organizations who are involved in this kind of work, and that remains to be a contested area, right? Because if you look at, for example, if I were to take the legal sort of example of the UK, and if you look at something like the IWF, now they are authorized. They are probably the only entity that is authorized to be able to not just look at this content, but also proactively search for this content and keep the internet safe. Now, that does not apply to India, because when we had started initially the hotline, and mind you, the minister and the chairperson of the National Commission for Protection of Children were at the event, and two months later, there was an inquiry set up on us saying you're soliciting for CSAM, which is when we had to remind them that we don't look at any of this content because we are not allowed to do so. But what I'm trying to say here is there has to be some sort of legal immunity or some sort of mechanism to be able to say that there are these trusted groups of people, because we've realized that the law enforcement has absolutely no capacity, and they clearly shouldn't be looking through so much content, because they need to really focus on the more severe cases as well. So I think that's a huge area, that it remains to be seen as to how that's going to evolve, and how that's going to take shape in India, and whether civil society organizations or private entities are able to do that. I mean, the moderators are doing it, the moderation agencies are doing it, but I think it still needs to be seen as to how civil society organizations can get in. I think the biggest issue is term. If somebody has to really work towards something, I feel it is about making the system, I feel, equitable. Equitable to ensure that everybody gets a fair chance to report, because currently if you're a rich person and your content is leaked, you'll be able to take it down. 100% you'll be able to take it down. You will have somebody working at Meta, you'll have somebody who's a lawyer. But if it's a victim coming from a rural background, coming from a community from a marginalized community, does he or she have access? Are the systems accessible? Is there equity in that access? I think that is the question that need to be asked, because I also think people like the trust line, our energies should go on focusing on more severe cases. But currently the systems are absolutely inaccessible, that we have to handhold victims through every
Yeah.
single process, and that's also a lot of energy and time, right? So how does everybody get
Yeah.
equal chance towards
That's
redressal?
so well put, Uma. I'm so glad I asked you that question. It validates at least one of our own findings about legal immunity, bona fide immunity, for civil society, or for mechanisms that need to sort of parse through this information, or at least process it in some manner, even if they're not looking at it, to be able to support and engage with victims. We've written a short policy paper on this, and we've recommended the same thing that you're recommending, based on actually conversations with people like you and from scholarship, where this point is often repeated, that legal immunity is very important for bona fide stakeholders.
Just a slightly different question, but based on the conversation that we were having, I wanted to ask how difficult is it for victims to collect evidence and then report, as well as for platforms to understand what constitutes NCII, because a case of an image which is not evidently sexual or does not contain nude images would also constitute NCII for victims in certain contexts. And this also closely ties with your question of equitability, that there are different contexts and different meanings of what constitutes a violation of privacy, or how people can be displayed in a sexual manner, depending upon the cultural context or socioeconomic background that they come from.
Yeah. So I think the first aspect of it is one of the most challenging things, right? Like, if the victims have not taken these screenshots, if they do not have evidence, becomes extremely difficult, right? So that's also part of some of the education and awareness building that we do, is where we say exactly what to do, not to delete, how to take these screenshots, etc. So there's scope for a lot of education and awareness around that. But the second aspect of it is whether the platforms get the context. And I think I'll elaborate this with a case example where I'm not going to name the platform, but this platform is huge and one of the most popular platforms in India. And a video was uploaded of this particular victim. It was a video that was consensually taken of her. She's an adult victim, her and her lover. And this video basically showed them, in getting in and out of different hotel rooms. There was some sort of intimate activity, but there was no nudity, so on and so forth. The relationship had broken off, and the accused took that video and he posted it on this particular platform with a very loving, caring song, saying how he misses her, how he, craves to go back to her, etc., etc. The victim was he and it was restricted mode, so he only sent it to her specific social circle. He only sent it to the aunt. It was not available for general public to view. But this was the way he was trying to threaten her to begin with, right? The victim reported it to us. We reported it to the platform. The video was taken down. 2 weeks later, the accused uploads a different uh, a variation of the same video. Let me put it this way: it was the same content, but it was cut differently, and the platform did not take it down. And they said it does not violate our policy. Now we were appalled, and the reason they gave us is, in the first video, the teeth marks of the victim were visible. In the second video, the teeth marks are not visible. And it was bizarre. It was the most bizarre. And what they came back to us was with came back to us was to say that the victim can take this down, but not under the sexual harassment policy. She can take it down by filing a privacy claim. Now, the privacy claim or whatever that form is, so we said the victim is from India. They said, okay, here you go. You get a form in Hindi. This victim is from South India. The victim doesn't speak a word of Hindi or English. And the team had to sit down and fill that whole form with her, trying to translate it into the local language, and then sent it to the platform, and then But it's not over there. When the privacy claim was raised, what they said is the accused is going to get a prompt saying that somebody has raised a privacy claim and this content is going to be action. And the victim got distressed again because now he's going to find out that the content is coming down. So it completely failed the victim, right? So this is where context matters, and platforms completely like seem to miss the boat, and they could not get the context. It was taken down, we escalated it, and we got a typical response from the platform, but it took us a good 2.5 weeks for us to be able to do it. But the same content, just cut in different ways, complete misregard for the context, disregard for the context, and what does it do to our victims?
Very closely tied to the response that you gave, I just have a small follow up question. I mean, I know it's not possible for you to answer this in a frame of 4 to 5 minutes, but on the top of your head, what can platforms do, or how can they change their reporting mechanisms to make them more accessible and more easy for the victims? Like the top pointers that come to your mind.
See, I think the most important thing is, number one, can we have a single window system? Yeah, because multiple platforms require different, standards of evidence, and that's a huge pain point. So there has to be some sort of a single window approach where if you're a victim of, let's say, NCII, or if you're a victim of cyberbullying, this is what all platforms need, and based on this is the minimum that platforms need, based on which the platform will look into the content and take action. The other thing I feel is forms that are extremely long, or forms where you have to sit and select categories. Now it's a technical job. I mean, the teams that work at Rati, they have kind of mastered the art of reading through their community guidelines, and they argue that this is a violation of this particular clause of your community guideline. Now you cannot expect a victim to be able to do that. How do you even define these things, that sometimes victims don't know? So how do you simplify terminology, and how do you make accessible by probably having it in different forms, not just a form? So maybe can a victim submit it in a way which is probably through other means, and not only writing through maybe a voice note, maybe, I mean, I don't know, right? I mean, there is no formula 44 to be able to crack this, but what we are saying is currently what is available most of the times seems like a huge barrier, because the standard of evidence is very high, the technicality that is expected is very high, and your average Indian user does not have that level of bandwidth to be able to articulate. So how do you simplify it? That's why I think anonymous reporting of cybercrime is something that one could look at and see what has worked, what has worked in that model, because clearly more and more people are reporting there. So what is working there is something that can be studied.
Thanks, Uma. That was very useful. And I think when we are working on reporting mechanisms or working on how regulation must be made, I think these pointers would be very useful for us to consider. And it gives us a lot of food for thought. Shashank, would you like to?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to add to what Tavishi was saying, we should talk to people like you more to add nuance to our suggestions. It is validating that some of our work is based on your experiences in organizations like yours, but we need to continue engaging in the conversation. I want to just point out before we end, just two, for me, two key insights that are emerging, right? And Uma, I think I'm on the side of your lane now, and I'm like, civil society needs to work more closely with platforms. We can't close them out with conversation. We will be doing ourselves a disservice. So thank you for convincing me towards that. I really, really sort of appreciate that. um, the second thing I'm realizing, which is a very important conversation that we have at CCG as well, is these questions of contextual moderation, platforms not tailoring their policies to regions, to countries, especially in the global south. We have much, much more heterogeneous societies. There are marginalization at so many layers. What privacy means to us, what nudity means to us, what nudity means
Yeah.
to the average Indian is so different from what nudity might mean to a European, and the comfort each society has with getting photographed or not. So many Indians are engaging with the technology of cameras for the first time. How does that change their social behavior and their social expectations? So I think this is something we care deeply about asking platforms to contextualize um, their policies to some of their largest markets, some of the markets that they're very proud of,
Yeah.
both whether it's in India
Yeah.
and other countries in the global south. So very some insights from me. But I'll pause there, and I know we've thrown a lot at you, Uma. Any thoughts that you want to share? You spoke about equity, which is such an important insight to learn from. But I'll create the awkward silence for a minute for you, if you want to sort of reflect on anything, add anything before we close.
Yeah. No, I think thank you. This was super for me as well to be able to listen to these questions and answer you guys. But having said all of this, I know we are an organization working on online safety and privacy, and making sure that the online spaces are safe. What I really want to ensure is that, because the online space is unsafe, because of that, no person in India should be denied access to meaningful internet, which is why organizations like ours exist, because we say, let children go on the internet, let women go on the internet, let them make a few mistakes. And if they do, how are we supporting them? How quickly are we supporting them? How robustly are we supporting them? I think that is where the efforts should be. There has to be minimum standards of support for victims, right? Minimum standards of support, of care, of protection for victims who go through this online. And the message cannot be, don't go online because this is going to happen to you. Mind you, in India, a lot of girls who we speak to are already self-censoring, especially girls and women. We are in an era of self-censorship, so we don't want to be able to tell our children and young people, don't go out there and explore. What we want to be able to tell them is, in the process of exploring, if something goes wrong, who do you turn to, and what should be the responsibility of those who you turn to? What is their responsibilities? I think if we can work on that, the world will be a better place, the internet will be a better place for
That
our
is the
children and
perfect
women.
note to end on, Uma. That's so beautifully put. Something that resonates with me, that goes back to a movement that began in the US a couple of years back. Is I want to express this in the say, let's occupy the internet with all communities and all societies, including children, right? And let's not. We have this
Yeah.
notion in India of banning things, or like having these moral
Yeah.
guidelines around access, and that's not going to be possible. Everyone's going to be online. Companies include and
Yeah.
the government want people to be online, so of course everyone's going to come online. And yes, let us occupy and make
Yeah.
this internet a safe space. Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation, Uma. It's a delight to always talk to you.
Can I just say one thing? This is just
Go
random
for it,
one
go for it.
thought that is
Yeah.
coming to my mind. I think the discourse around policy sometimes, it happens in such a vacuum, and it's so disconnected with the lived realities of so many marginalized children in this country. It's ridiculous. Let me just put it that way. It's ridiculous, because we are here talking about excessive screen time, when majority of the children in this country do not even have meaningful access to the internet, where girls are still using internet, shared internet from their brother's phone, father's phone. So I think whoever is working on policy, safety, has to have their feet on the ground, has to look at researchers like the Ideal Internet and many more researchers that are connected to the lived realities of marginalized children. Otherwise, it's an echo chamber which
Yeah.
caters to the elite and which
Yep.
serves the elite.
Absolutely. No, no, please don't be.
Sorry.
I absolutely agree with you. And that's the reason we want to create spaces for voices like you, Uma, of people who work with people who actually face the realities of the internet and highlight that and be conscious of our own elite lens as well. And we will ensure that in whatever is in our capacity.
I didn't
No,
mean
I'm.
you,
I'm.
you as
That's
in
my
like
self.
you as
That's
in
my
your
self-reflection. Please
organization.
don't worry about it. As you were talking to us, I'm thinking, you know, can we put you in front when the government is making law on the internet? We're like, you need to listen to her. You need to listen to because when you will hear what she's doing, you will care about it. So, thank you so much for again articulating that very well.
I agree with what Uma just said and what Shashank you said. I think both technical conversations, both policy and legal conversations, all of them happen in such an echo chamber without actually centering the experiences of those who are most marginalized. That there needs to be a complete overhaul, and all of us need to rethink on how we research, how we do advocacy, how we write, and how we design policies.
Take a minute to say thank you to you. Thanks so much, Uma, for that wonderful conversation. Again, I'm repeating myself. It's always a delight to listen to you and to listen up to you about your work, about what you do, and your passion is almost infectious. I'm leaving this conversation very energized. uh, Thank you so much. We all face so many challenges in doing the work we do. It's important to have these conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, but can I also say thank you you guys for creating this space, for also letting people like us, enter this discourse and basically take everything that I told you and articulate it in a way that the policymakers understand. So I think that job is equally difficult. So not to take away from the folks that work on public policy, technology, etc. So I think thank you. That's a very very critical space. Thank you for just creating this space and letting me just talk.
All for that, Uma. Thank you so much.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.